It's really my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Houria Djoudi. She works for the Center for International Forestry Research based in Bogor, Indonesia. And she started life as a pastoralist in Algeria, which I think is really cool. And she's now working on adaptation, and environmental change with a focus on gender and power, am I allowed to say that, Houria, for dryland forests. So I'll turn you over to Houria, and hope you all enjoy. We will have time for questions at the end, hopefully.
Yes. So. Hello, everybody. I'm loud enough or not? Can you hear me there? Okay. So I'm very happy to be here with you, and thanks for Michelle and for Grace for organizing this meeting or this workshop. I would like today to share a little bit of the work we do in CIFOR in relation to gender and to climate change. And I will start with something I think everybody of us kind of know. We have the capacity to adapt to changes, are they environmental or not, is shaped by power relations. And it's shaped by power relations because access to resources, access to information, and also options and choices are important to be able to adapt. So we assume that climate change, because of that, will affect people in a different way. I mean, that seems like something very clear, but I would like to tell you that last week I was in Flare, this weekend actually, in the conference, and somebody was presenting something about a system. And that was a question in the room asking about, well, I am a bit critical about your system because I don't see power there. And the response was, power is everywhere. And this question and these answers are very typical, actually, because when you ask somebody in a presentation or in where is power, the response will be, power is everywhere. Yes, it is everywhere. But how do we deal with this in our research and in our work? And how do we frame it? And this is the question I think we need to think a little bit more about. So what I would like to present today is, from the work we do in the drylands, I would try to show you or to share with you some kind of results we have about how gender interact with climate change. And I think I would like to explain that for me, working on gender is one way to answer this question about power. Because gender is something where I can understand power, but in a more concrete and real way than just leaving it somewhere there in the room and saying power is everywhere. So gender is a way to understand how power relations and how also the changes and the shift in power relations happen. This is the first part. The second part, I would like to share with you a study we did on trying to understand how gender is framed in the climate change literature. And I hope that for the discussion we will have kind of what are the perspectives, how are we going to address the gaps we identify. I would start with a study we did in Burkina Faso, and maybe for a lot of people who work on natural resources, this is very clear, but a lot of people still maybe have some doubts about the role or the interaction between adaptation, gender, and resources. This is here a work we did regarding restored areas. So this is like little part in a very, very dry and very, very degraded landscape where people decide actually to restore 3 hectares per household, and then we looked actually who is using and how are these resources which were restored used. What we found is that actually women, they have a very strong focus on products which are used directly for consumption, products which are used for food security and for especially for the kids and for themselves. And we found also that firewood, which is also related to the food security, is one of the most most women actually benefit from this area. It seems like something we know, but there are a lot of studies showing actually or ignoring the link between the dependency on natural resources for the poorest, and specifically for the women, and also for the food security. Here we went a little bit further, because in the first one we have just the link between, okay, women are using these resources. We went a bit further in another study, and we looked actually, when are women using these resources from the forest, from the trees, and we had 1 year which was really kind of a disaster year. It was 2011, where the whole agricultural production actually collapsed because there was no rain. So we looked what, in this situation, what are women using, or the household and women using to cope with this situation. So when we try to understand that, we use the kind of a very local context thinking, because in West Africa, food security is really kind of very gendered. So you have the man who will provide the whole grains, the cereals, to fill the granary. So let's now we have a household with a very, like a granary which is full with cereals. When this is empty, this is the woman's role to buy the cereals. So women have to go to the market to buy the grains for the household. So we were thinking, what are the resources women actually use to play this role, or to be able to buy the cereals? And we found actually that wood fuel was one of very, very important products, that a household who is selling wood is about 4 times more likely to buy cereals. So those women actually, they get their capacity, or their opportunity to buy cereals to fill the granaries by using wood fuel. So here is not only the link between like the gendered use of natural resources, but here there is a direct link to the safety net and to the adaptation to changes in the environment. We have the same, this is just another example, we have the same for the shea nuts. This is exactly the same with a little bit less correlation, but it's the same trend. So now, we know that resources are important. We know that they are important also to adapt, to make household, or to make women, porous household, more resilient. But when we looked at the rights, this is where we actually had a big contradiction, because the women who are assuring food security, when we looked at the right, they have to use resources. And here it's an example from one of a food tree women they use. We figured out actually that 60% of women do not have access, a secured access to the resources. And when we went further, when we looked who are those women who don't have access to the resources, we figured out actually most of them, like 78%, are migrant women. So women who came from the north with their family to settle in the region. So this is not enough here to look only, there are women using resources to adapt, but it seems that this is not enough, because even in the group of women we are looking at, there is a stratification, there is a difference between a woman and another woman. And here in this case, the differentiation is the migration background in this case. So you could find a woman who has access, but you can also find a woman who has no access because she is migrant. So this is now an example from Mali. In this region, we did work on adaptation, and we tried to understand how are communities adapting to drought in this case. And we tried to link the adaptive strategies to the forest. Oops. What happened? It's no problem. To see what are the differentiation in the adaptation patterns. And here we see like the men in pastoral communities and women in farmer communities. There's just an example. We have many of this. I just took them because when we look at this, we find that women actually have short-term adaptation strategies or coping strategies to reach long-term adaptation strategies. The short-term strategies in this case was charcoal production. But when we talk to women, what do you want to do? What is your objective? Education of kids was actually their objectives, to get out of the system. When we looked at men, we saw that actually migration is one of the most important strategies for men. Now, what is the link between these two? The link between these two is that women actually, they are not only adapting to the change in the environment, they are also adapting to the fact that men are migrating. So the changes which resulted because the men are migrating, women had also to deal with that. So they are, of course, different pattern of migration, but what we saw is that if migration was not successful, women had to take girls out of the school to help them in the household. So remember that I told you that the objective of women is education, right? So if the men migrate, migration is not successful, women cannot reach. They cannot have their kids educated because they have to take them out of the school to help. So there is a link, indeed, between the adaptation strategies of different groups. And this is why we need the social differentiation. We need to understand more about who is adapting to what. In this sense, one of my, actually, when I started working on gender and adaptation, one of the most, how to say, like major stories where I learned a lot myself is that I told you about the charcoal production. So women are producing charcoal, they are selling the charcoal to send their kids to schools, but then we wanted to look who is actually using this charcoal. And in this region, actually, I did the research with Maria Brockhaus, who is here, and it was really fascinating. So in this region, I have to say, this is in northern Mali, there is a kind of social differentiation between women from a higher class and women who are the former slaves, which are actually now kind of sharing this experience of the environmental change in this region. So of course, when we were there, we thought the women who are actually the former slaves are the ones who are most vulnerable. This is how we went there, because of course we always go with certain assumptions. We discovered actually that women from the higher class, they cannot use this strategy because of cultural limitations. Charcoal is seen as something in the forest, something dirty. They cannot use it. And the women who we thought they are the most vulnerable are the ones who are able now to use the charcoal to adapt to the change. What I mean here is that when we do research or when we work, we have a lot of assumptions which are, of course, coming from our social background, our academic education, where are we from ourselves, and we cannot assume that we go somewhere without all this assumption with us. So I was very surprised, kind of positively surprised, when I discovered that what I was thinking was actually completely wrong, and I have to develop a different concept to look at things which is more flexible and which looks also in a more context-specific ways to things. I was thinking, from what I was presenting, maybe just a few thoughts for the ones of us who are joining the workshop, but also for everybody here. When we think gender, or when we think in general power, when we think, we need to think about rights. And we assume often that, for instance, we can secure food without securing rights. And this is what we see in the Sahel, that the women who are actually securing food are securing this food based on insecure rights. So are we really able to move on with this contradiction that, for instance, rights are not always a part of the thinking and a part of the work we are doing? How are we dealing with that? The same for the adaptive capacity and the resilience. It's like, how can we reach that without secured rights? And another point from the example of Mali, from this example of charcoal production and women, how are shifts happening actually in terms of power in response to an environmental change? Because everything, even like when you choose, at least in the context of the Sahel, when you do restoration, the fact that you are choosing this tree and this tree based on absolutely clear biophysical determinant, you are changing power relations somewhere. You are changing the social system somewhere. So we need really to think a little bit more about this link and bring this link kind of stronger, and therefore it's very important to understand power in the work we are doing. So now I'm moving to the second part of the presentation, and this second part actually is linked to the first part, at least in my own career, because I started like that. I started looking at, oh, what are women using, what are men using, and so I moved on and on and on, and I am more and more feeling that the concept and the approaches we are having, they are not really reflecting the complexity we are meeting in the real life. So it's not only like a lot of other authors, like for instance Sima or Johnson, who wrote this beautiful piece of paper where she argues that women are seen in the climate change arena as being the victims or as being the champions. We also see that, as from the charcoal example, that this homogeneity, that community are homogeneous or women are homogeneous, is something which is hindering us to move on in our work. And this is what we end up having, simplistic dichotomies which fail to capture actually the range of complexities and the power dynamics and vulnerabilities. So what we did to understand, we were at this point that we feel there is something happening there. We see the gaps, that women are homogeneous, communities are homogeneous. So we were looking for something like a concept, an approach to try to address this gap we are feeling. And this is how we come up with we find in the concept of intersectionality. What is intersectionality? Actually, it's something very simple. Intersectionality is just the fact that social differentiation is important, and the more determinant you have in the social differentiation, the more you capture the complexities and you understand the patterns. I always give this example of myself. I am a woman from Algeria, coming from a Berber region, so we are called indigenous people in North Africa. When I am in Algeria, I am indigenous woman, but then I moved to, so I have to deal with this role. Then I moved to Germany, and suddenly I'm a migrant. And it doesn't matter what I had before, but I have to deal with these changes. I have to deal with the migration as a part of my identity. And intersectionality means just that you cannot see me just as a woman, you cannot see me just as this. We have to have different determinants which will explain my role or my position in a certain context. This is actually that's what it is. And I wrote here some quotes, I think you are reading it, which explains more this concept. But in fact, this is very simple. Well, it's not. Because what happens is that we end up adding, saying this is this, plus that, plus that. But this is also not this. So it's not that simple, it's a bit more complex, and therefore it addresses some issues we are identifying, but it doesn't also address everything. But this is just a way to try to understand a little bit more, or to take in account a little bit more power. What we did in this work, we tried to understand how intersectional is climate change literature, or at least which are the part of the intersectionality framework which are already there and what is missing. So we reviewed papers in the climate change literature. We wanted actually to do both mitigation and adaptation, but we end up not finding enough papers on mitigation, which is also a response on itself, because why are women the adapters and men the mitigators, or why are we not having enough literature on mitigation and adaptation? So this is one of the results, but we forget about the mitigation and we decided we focus on adaptation, and we developed for the analysis what we called an intersectionality framework. And please, this is not something which I would say this is applicable everywhere or feasible everywhere. This is an attempt to answer and to address some gaps. So we are learning by doing that, and we are developing this framework, but we are still open to look at it in a very critical way too. So what we did is we developed a set of questions to see how can we apply this concept in literature. And these questions were related to the following categories which are there. So we wanted to see which are the social groups, what is the social differentiation the papers or the studies refer to. We wanted also to know how power relations are produced, reproduced, and resisted in this literature. Is there any reference to that? We wanted also to see what are the multi-level dynamics, because power is not always, there are multi-dimensions of power, and when you look at what we find most of the time is that power, the vertical power coming, for instance, from the state to communities, we have a lot of work done there. But what we found that is not really there is the power at one level, for instance, at the community level. I don't know why, but I think I have some ideas why, is because sometimes we have a kind of a feeling this is first complex, but this is also the way, the romanticizing of communities, that we are not able to touch to some point which might be sensitive in a certain context, so we kind of avoid them. But they are very important, particularly in relation to resources. So we try to understand, is there any multi-level relationship across various levels of the society? The last point is actually very important, because it's not like power relations are not, in a certain, they are not going in a linear way. So I would say where there is power, there is resistance to power. Where there is power, there is strategies to cope with power. And most of the time we don't, we are not aware about this. So we try to understand, is in the literature only references to power as such, or is there anything also talking or relating to the strategies, to the resistance and to the transformation, and look to see if we have what we call emancipation patterns in the literature and in the way the studies were done. So now I'm telling you a little bit what we find in this research, and the first thing which we actually, what was coming out from that, is that what we call the Olympics of vulnerability. So what do we mean with that? We mean with that we have the feeling that everybody is going out there, including myself when I started, looking for the most vulnerable. Who are the most vulnerable? And we want to help those most vulnerable. Rather than looking which are the interactions between groups, which are the interactions, the shift happening, the negotiation patterns, we just look for the more vulnerable. And one reason I think for that is that, at least in our research, we are kind of related to some finance, some donors. So the idea is, okay, if you find the more vulnerable, maybe an agency will say, okay, this is where we want to work, this is where we want to put the money. But the issue of that, or the problem with that, is that we are creating we are producing some very kind of ambiguous pictures of what is happening there. But this is what actually was really clear, that we have a lot of statement for that. For instance, one of them is that many papers, they argue in the introduction, they argue in the other part that women are vulnerable. So what we did is we checked. They are saying women are vulnerable. We looked at the data. We looked at, they are saying that based on what? And we were really surprised to find that I think 25 or 23% of the papers saying women are vulnerable, and when we looked at them, only 2% had really kind of did have data or showing data. So there is this women are vulnerable narrative out there, but when we look at it, we didn't really find the base or the evidence or the argument for that. I'm not saying women are not vulnerable, I'm not saying women are vulnerable. What I'm saying is that there is a kind of a narrative which is there running there. And I think that this narrative is hindering us to take in account the complexity and to look at the things how they are. And in terms of intersectionality, we didn't really find much. That most of the papers are really framed in still the dichotomy of men and women. So very few papers were referring to other determinants of identities or other social differentiation. This is something I think we need to address, or we are trying to figure out, I hope in this workshop, which kind of perspective we could advance to have more complexity out there, to understand more power relations. We then find something also very interesting, which was actually that there is a certain evidence out there about female-headed households which are more vulnerable, but through this process of how the gender is framed in the literature, we saw that there is a shift or a move from female households are vulnerable to all women are vulnerable. So there is a kind of generalization of this narrative which is out there, and where we end up having a generalized feminization of vulnerability. Another point which is I find very interesting, and therefore it will be interesting also to discuss this, is going back to the emancipation pattern I was talking about before. Is we looked at the paper and we saw, is there any evidence or any reference to the resistance to power, to the emancipatory pathways of against power? And what we found actually that there are few examples, but this is really like three examples. One of them is actually this Mali example I was showing, where you show that actually the whole power issue is not a linearity there. This is something which is negotiable. You have power with others, against others, collective, individual power. So the whole shift in power could be something which might change the whole power context. And one example actually is migration, because migration has an impact on the demographic context, and therefore when you have like villages, for instance, in Mali, where every man almost which is less than, which is young, is gone, what happens then? Are women able to take over some social space? Are they able to take over some responsibilities or not? What is going to happen there? And this is a kind of an example, because when people adapt, if the adaptive strategy is changing the social relation, we need to think about what is coming out of there. And we didn't find much, but I think this is a very important way to look at things, because in this case, for example, of Mali, these women who are doing charcoal might be in a kind of emancipatory pathway, while when we come, we think they are vulnerable. So this is very important to understand what are the shifts in the system, in the ecological system, and what are the shifts in the power, and to always link these together. I would like now to conclude with some thoughts, and I mean, this is just to open the discussion. There is certain evidence about the gender nature of adaptation, which is, as I explained, based on many different and complex determinants together. But we really need to question the gendered polarities. And we need to understand that actually the power context where adaptation is happening, this is the one we need to understand the most before trying to get to use, for instance, a gender framework. We need to understand, are we really understanding the power context in the places we are working in? And this is very important, because if not, we will end up in the polarities. And I really like the mutual fragility concept from Chakart, because it is something which gets us out of this, of those polarities, and which bring us more in an understanding of power as a dynamic issue. And this is the last thing, to go back a bit to the concept, to the intersectionality. And I would say that after using this approach, or after analyzing this approach, I would say this is an approach which could help actually to address certain gaps. But even here, we need to understand more about in which context and how going to apply it. So this is not something you can just take and say, okay, this is, I'm doing intersectional, so we will end up in the same thing. Because when we started, we didn't use gender approaches, so now we are using gender approaches and then we stop there. This is the same with intersectionality. We cannot say, oh, now we have the response. We are happy because we are adding now more determinant, we are social groups, we are looking at different things. So we still need to stay critical by using those frameworks and applying them in a certain context. So I think my presentation ends here, and thank you.